Hiya folks, it's Jocelyn. Welcome back to Yogi with a Book. As we're getting closer towards the end of the year, I wanted to do a lot more videos that were a little bit shorter, but we're still wrapping up my year of reading. So today we're going to be starting a series of videos which is just about my favorite authors of the year and the different categories they fall into. Today, with the first video, we are going to be talking about my favorite debuts. So all of these books that I've read by these authors were their first, and all except one were debuts from this year. So I'm going to start with the backlist title first, and one of my favorite debuts that I read this year was The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. This is the first book in the Devabad trilogy, and the second book comes out very soon. It comes out in January, and I actually have an arc of it, so I am halfway through my reread as of today. But this book completely blew me away. I gave this a 5-star that starts in historic Cairo, but then moves on to this Jinn city that's Devabad, and we have such a great cast of characters. I'm just really in the middle of all of my feels because I'm revisiting all of these characters and all of their exploits, and there's so much amazing world building that I had forgotten about, just so many minute details in here. We have 2 point of view characters. One is Nari, who is a thief who was brought up in Egypt. She was living in Cairo and just is sort of a con woman in general. She's a pickpocket. She uses her powers of healing to really just swindle people out of their money as like a psychic. And then one day she actually conjures up a deva when she's performing this ceremony that she thinks is complete and utter bull, and it turns out it's not. The other point of view is Ali, who's a prince in the city of Devabad. So we get to see his experience, we have all of his knowledge of this world and her lack thereof. So those 2 point of views work really well together. And just in general, it's lots of adventure, a beautifully fleshed out world, and just such great banter. Everything about it I think is stellar, and I'm super excited to pick up the next book in this series. Another author I'm sure no one is surprised to hear me put on this list is Elizabeth Acevedo, and her debut came out this year, which was The Poet X. Immediately after finishing this book, I put it on basically all of my top lists because this story just touched me in so many different ways. I actually originally read it as an audiobook, and it's narrated by Elizabeth Acevedo herself, and just hearing the way she speaks these words makes it so much more powerful. This book is told in verse, and we follow Xiomara, who was an Afro-Dominican teenager growing up in New York City, and so we follow her and her life with all of the trials and tribulations of her being Black and Latina and curvy and a woman and coming from a really strict religious family. And I don't really know how many other things I need to say for you to pick this up because it's just completely wonderful. Elizabeth Acevedo also won, I believe, the National Book Award. So if you don't fully trust my opinion, then I would hope you would at least trust their opinion because, by God, this is one of the best books I've read this year. It's already made its rounds a little bit, but With the Fire on High is going to be Elizabeth Acevedo's next book, and I just cannot wait to read more YA contemporaries with Afro-Latina women at the front. And then moving on to little less hyped territory, the first book we're going to talk about is Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi. This is another debut that came out this year. I think it was February, and I originally got this as an e-copy from NetGalley, so I got to read the arc, and immediately upon reading it, I went out and bought it, and Emezi was actually talking in New York City, which I was super excited to go to, and just to hear more about their process and what they were trying to do with this book. I think part of the reason that this book isn't talked about a lot is because it's difficult to really pinpoint what it's about. I think it's very easy for Western audiences to just sort of put this into a book that has to do with like mental illness, because yes, the main character I think is pretty much diagnosed with DID, dissociative identity disorder, but listening to Emezi speak about this and hearing how autobiographical this is, it's really not so much about mental illness, but really more of a completely different reality and way of seeing things that's really rooted in Nigerian culture. Though this book is told from the inside of our main character's head, it's told from different points of view because Ada's self is fragmented. You see, the Ada is an Ogbanje, which from my understanding is mostly that she's a human vessel for these godlike beings. If that sounds hard to follow, I promise it actually isn't in here, but this isn't so much a plot-driven book as it is a character study on the Ada, and we get to hear how she grows up as experienced by the different beings inside of her. This is one of the darkest books I've read this year and has a host of trigger warnings, but there's also some really amazing rep. Its own voices for the Obanje part, and also Akwaeke Emezi, I believe, is genderqueer. At this point they use they-them pronouns, though when I first talked about this book, they were also using she/her pronouns, and so there's some earlier videos where I'm using that instead. So if you're looking for something that's queer, something that's black, and something that's a little bit left of Western sensibilities, I would definitely pick this up, especially because Akwaeke Emezi's prose is just absolutely stunning. I believe Akwaeke also has a few things set up for the future, but one of them is definitely a YA book called Pet. I don't remember anything about the synopses. All I know is that I heard that it was announced and immediately added it to my TBR because that's just how impressed I was by their writing. Another debut author that I don't think enough people are talking about is Rebecca Roanhorse, who wrote Trail of Lightning, which is probably my favorite dystopian I've read this year. I think this is the only one on the list that I actually gave 4.5 stars, but it was just so much fun. This is an urban fantasy that's rooted in Navajo culture and mythology and is completely unlike anything I've ever read, but it's such a gritty and intense world, and it gave me a lot of Supernatural vibes when Supernatural was really at its peak. The main character here is Maggie, who is a monster hunter, and at the start she is on a hunt before things start to go awry. Maggie's supernatural clan powers make her an incredible force to be reckoned with, and one of the best monster hunters out there. She was also trained by a pseudo-god former lover who just left her out of the blue and is still a little bit angry about it, but fortunately we get to see a little bit of her coming to terms with that. And also added into the mix is Kai, who's a healer with a past that he's not quite willing to talk about. Honestly, if you like urban fantasy, I just say pick this up. Apparently it follows a lot of tropes that are really common to that genre, though I'm not as versed in it, so I can't totally confirm that is what I've heard. All I know is that it was super action-packed. I really loved the setting of the American Southwest, and also the way Rebecca Roanhorse talks about climate change and about Native Americans taking back their land. This is another first book in a series, and I think the second book will be out next year. But regardless, she's also going to be part of the Rick Riordan Presents imprint with a middle grade book coming out, so I'm also super looking forward to that. And finally, a recent favorite I have is Empire of Sand by Tasha Suri. This is another one that I've heard virtually no one talk about, but it's not for lack of me screaming about it. This is a desert fantasy that was inspired by the Mughal Empire in India, and like City of Brass, we also get to see some jinn in here, but in a very different way. This book is far more interested in talking about relationships, and more than anything else, choice. Our main character, Mare, is a mixed-race woman who grows up in her father's court. After one day being caught dancing in Dreamfire, she's faced with the choice of persecution or a marriage with a man she doesn't know. She goes for the marriage, and I'm so glad she does, and ends up taking residence with this really religious, mystic sort of figure and all of his disciples. Through the journey, she figures out exactly why she was chosen to be part of this marriage and what the Maha wants with her, but the ride to get there just had me on the edge of the seat the whole time. This is another one that plays very heavily with a lot of tropes, but they happen to be tropes that I really like. At the forefront is a sort of fake relationship, marriage of convenience hybrid, because while she does marry this man, neither of them really go into this marriage with wanting it to happen, and so them trying to figure out this relationship, and more than that, figuring out how to survive, makes it so much more interesting. Magic, gods, Dreamfire. I feel like that's all I should have to say about this, but I love it so much and I still haven't figured out how to talk about it, so I cannot wait until Tasha Suri comes out with something else. This is another one that I believe is going to be part of a series, but from what I can gather, it's going to be more of a companion series, and the next book will actually be following someone different. So those were 5 debuts that blew me away. Most of them got 5 stars, one of them got 4.5, but all of them were ones I would recommend, especially because most of them have to do with mythology, and if you know anything about me at this point, you should probably recognize that if there's something about mythology in it, I'm going to read it. Let me know down below what debut authors you read this year that really blew you away, and I'll be back with another author video in this series shortly. Bye!